In a quiet, forgotten village shrouded in mist, an unspeakable tragedy unfolded. A priest, bound by faith but haunted by whispers of betrayal, was buried alive. What followed turned the serene graveyard into a place of terror, where the veil between life and death was torn apart. Let's begin. The villagers gathered in the grey light of the overcast morning, their faces drawn and somber. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, though no one dared to speak of it. The priest's funeral was not like any other they had attended. There were no hymns, no prayers of solace offered for the soul of the departed. Instead, there was silence. A suffocating, heavy silence that seemed to echo louder than any words could. The priest's coffin was simple, unadorned, and closed tightly. No one in the village questioned why there was no viewing of the body or why his burial was arranged so quickly. Rumors swirled among the townsfolk. Some said he had committed an unspeakable sin, while others whispered of a falling out with the church. But these whispers were quickly silenced with sharp glances and gestures to keep quiet. No one wanted to invite the wrath of God, or worse, the priest himself. As the coffin was carried through the graveyard, the pallbearers moved stiffly, their hands gripping the edges of the wood as though reluctant to let it touch them. A few children clung to their mothers, their wide, frightened eyes darting to the dark, yawning hole in the ground where the coffin would be laid. The wind picked up, carrying a faint, almost imperceptible sound, a murmur, a whisper that made the hair on the back of their necks stand on end. The gravedigger, a man named Old Thomas, stood by the edge of the pit, his weathered hands gripping his shovel. He was a man who had buried more people than he cared to count, but today his hands trembled as he adjusted his grip. He muttered a quick prayer under his breath, a habit he had long abandoned but found himself instinctively returning to on this day. His eyes flicked nervously to the coffin as it was lowered into the ground. The first shovelful of dirt hit the coffin with a hollow thud. It was a sound that usually marked closure, the finality of a life now gone. But today, it sounded more like a warning, a knock on the door of something best left undisturbed. The villagers shifted uncomfortably, their unease growing with each passing moment. Even the priest conducting the burial seemed hurried, his words rushed and almost mumbled, as if he wanted to finish the ceremony and leave as quickly as possible. It was then that the first sound came, a faint, almost imperceptible thump. At first, no one noticed. The shovels of dirt continued to fall, one after the other, masking the noise. But as the grave began to fill, the thumping grew louder, more insistent. Some of the villagers froze, their ears straining to hear over the rustling of the wind and the murmur of whispers among the crowd. "Did you hear that?" a woman whispered, clutching her shawl tightly around her shoulders. Her husband shook his head, his face pale, but he didn't respond. The villagers were all hearing it now, though no one wanted to admit it. The thumping grew louder still, and with it came something worse, a muffled, desperate cry. "Help me!" The voice was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. It came from the grave. Panic rippled through the crowd. Some stepped back, their hands covering their mouths in shock. Others glanced at one another, searching for confirmation that they weren't losing their minds. Old Thomas dropped his shovel, his face ashen. The priest conducting the ceremony paused mid-sentence, his eyes wide with terror. The cries continued, more frantic now. The words were muffled by the earth, but clear enough to send a chill down the spine of everyone present. "Please, I'm still here." No, that's impossible," someone muttered. "He's dead. He has to be dead." The crowd began to murmur, their voices rising in a cacophony of fear and confusion. A few brave souls moved closer to the grave, peering into the partially filled hole as if expecting to see something, anything that could explain the horror unfolding before them. "We have to dig him out," a young man shouted, stepping forward. His voice was tinged with desperation, his hands trembling as he reached for the shovel that old Thomas had dropped. But before he could take action, the priest conducting the ceremony raised his hand. "No," the priest said firmly, his voice shaking but resolute. This is a test of faith. We cannot interfere." "A test of faith?" a woman shrieked. "He's alive in there. We can't just leave him." The priest's face darkened, his jaw tightening. "He is not alive," he said, his voice now carrying an edge of authority. "What you hear is not of this world. It is a trick, a deception meant to lead us astray." The crowd fell silent, their eyes darting between the priest and the grave. The cries from below grew weaker, fainter, as if the voice was being swallowed by the earth itself. The young man hesitated, his hands gripping the shovel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. But he didn't move. One by one, the villagers began to turn away, their faces pale and haunted. They shuffled back to their homes, unable to bear the weight of what they had witnessed. Old Thomas, his hands shaking, resumed shoveling the dirt, his lips moving in a silent prayer. The cries had stopped by the time the last mound of earth was placed over the grave, but the silence that followed was even more chilling. As the villagers left the graveyard, the wind carried with it a faint whisper, a sound that would haunt them for the rest of their days. The priest's grave was silent, but the sense of unease lingered, a heavy, oppressive weight that seemed to press down on the entire village. No one spoke of what had happened, but they all knew one thing for certain. Something had gone terribly wrong that day, and whatever it wasn't over. The nights following the priest's burial were unnervingly quiet at first, the kind of quiet that wasn't comforting, but oppressive, an absence of sound that made even the smallest noise seem like a deafening roar. The villagers went about their lives during the day, trying to forget what they had heard during the burial, but as darkness fell, their unease grew. Doors were bolted earlier than usual, curtains drawn tightly, and candles left burning long into the night. Though no one spoke openly about it, they all shared the same fear. The priest's cries had not been a figment of their imagination. The first report came from old Thomas, the gravedigger. Known for his gruff demeanor and resilience, he was not a man easily shaken. But one morning, he arrived at the village square, pale and trembling, his usual stoic expression replaced by one of sheer terror. He muttered incoherently about noises from the graveyard, sounds he couldn't explain. "It's like he's still there," Thomas whispered to anyone who would listen, his voice cracking with emotion. "I heard him. I swear, I heard him." Most dismissed Thomas's words as the ramblings of an old man who had spent too much time among the dead. But that night, others began to hear it too. The first sounds were faint, so faint that they were easy to dismiss as the rustling of leaves or the creak of an old tree swaying in the wind. But as the hours dragged on, the sounds grew louder, more distinct. It started as a low, rhythmic thumping, like something pounding against wood. Then came the whispers. They weren't words exactly, more like fragments of breath carried on the wind, but they were unmistakable. The voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, weaving through the air and slipping into the cracks of locked doors and shuttered windows. By the third night, the whispers had become cries. Desperate, pleading cries that sent chills down the spines of those who heard them. "Help me!" the voice wailed, echoing through the village streets. "Don't leave me here!" Families huddled together in their homes, clutching crosses and reciting prayers in trembling voices. Some tried to drown out the sounds with music or by covering their ears, but it was no use. The cries seemed to seep into their very bones, filling their minds with a suffocating dread. A group of villagers, desperate to find the source of the disturbances, ventured to the graveyard one night with lanterns in hand. Their steps were hesitant, their breaths shallow as they approached the priest's grave. The closer they got, the louder the sounds became. It was no longer just cries, but a cacophony of voices, moans, wails, and guttural noises that defied explanation. When they reached the grave, their lanterns flickered and dimmed as if the very air around them was draining the light. The ground beneath their feet felt cold and heavy, as though something beneath the surface was reaching up to pull them down. One man leaned in closer to the freshly turned soil, his ear to the ground, and recoiled with a scream. "He's still alive!" the man shouted, stumbling backward. "I heard him. He's still down there." Panic erupted among the group. Some wanted to dig up the grave immediately, while others argued against it, their voices rising in fear and confusion. One woman, clutching a rosary, fell to her knees and began to pray loudly, her words trembling as tears streamed down her face. "Dear God," she sobbed, "forgive us. Forgive us for what we've done." Before they could decide what to do, a chilling wind swept through the graveyard, extinguishing their lanterns and plunging them into darkness. The cries stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence that was almost worse. The group fled back to the village, their courage shattered and their minds reeling from what they had witnessed. Over the following days, the disturbances grew more frequent and more intense. The whispers no longer confined themselves to the graveyard, but began to echo through the village at all hours. Some villagers claimed they heard the priest's voice calling their names. Others reported seeing fleeting shadows that moved unnaturally through the streets. Doors that had been securely locked were found wide open in the morning, and strange, claw-like marks appeared on windowsills and walls. Animals were the first to abandon the village. Dogs howled incessantly before breaking free of their leashes and running off into the woods. Cats hissed at unseen forces, their fur standing on end, before disappearing without a trace. Even the birds, which usually roosted in the trees around the village, were nowhere to be found. The absence of animal life only heightened the villagers' sense of isolation and dread. Despite the growing terror, the villagers clung to their denial. They told themselves it was their imaginations, that the grief and guilt of the burial had clouded their minds. But deep down, they knew the truth. Something was terribly wrong, and it was tied to the priest's grave. One night, the village elder called a meeting to address the escalating fears. The small church was packed with pale-faced villagers, their whispered conversations filled with speculation and fear. The elder, a man who had lived through wars and plagues, stood at the pulpit, his hands gripping the edges tightly as he spoke. "We cannot let fear consume us," he said, though his voice wavered slightly. "Whatever is happening, it is a test of our faith. We must remain strong." His words did little to comfort the crowd. One woman stood up, her voice shaking with anger and desperation. "A test of faith!" she cried. "This isn't a test. It's a curse. We buried him alive, and now he's punishing us." The room erupted into chaos, villagers shouting over one another as panic overtook them. The elder raised his hands, trying to restore order, but the tension in the room was too great. The meeting ended with no solutions, only more fear and uncertainty. That night, as the villagers returned to their homes, the whispers began again. They were louder this time, more insistent, as if whatever was causing them was growing stronger. And for the first time, the whispers carried a new message, one that would haunt the villagers long after the night was over. I will not rest. The nights following the growing whispers became something far darker. The air in the village felt heavy, as though a storm was perpetually brewing just beyond the horizon. Each sunset seemed to bring with it a deeper darkness, not just of the night, but of something unspoken, something that pressed against the edges of reason. By now, the villagers had all heard the whispers, the cries, the pleading voice of the priest. But what began next was worse, far worse. It started innocuously enough. A few villagers reported seeing strange movements in the graveyard. Old Thomas, the gravedigger, was the first to describe them. He swore he had seen shadows darting between the tombstones, figures that didn't move like people. They weren't walking, he whispered to the baker one morning over a loaf of bread. They were gliding, sliding like smoke, but solid somehow. And they watched me. His words spread through the village like wildfire. Skeptics dismissed him as a superstitious old fool, but those who had already seen too much listened with grim faces, their fear deepening. Over the next few nights, more sightings were reported. Villagers who dared to pass near the cemetery at night described similar shadowy figures, dark forms that seemed to writhe and shift like they were made of something unnatural. These figures didn't just move, they lingered, watching anyone who came too close. Soon, the shadows began to expand beyond the boundaries of the graveyard. They appeared in alleyways, at the edges of fields, and even outside the windows of homes. Farmers reported seeing them at the edges of their lantern light while tending to livestock late at night. One man described a shadow that seemed to stretch unnaturally tall, with limbs that bent in ways no human body ever could. It was there, he said, his voice trembling, just watching me. I could feel its eyes, if it even had eyes, boring into me. I ran, and I swear I could hear it following, even though it didn't make a sound. The children in the village were the first to name them. They called them the Whispering Shadows, a name that quickly spread. At first, the adults dismissed it as childish fancy, but when the children began waking up screaming in the middle of the night, describing the same dark shapes standing in their rooms, no one could deny the reality anymore. One particularly chilling incident involved a young girl named Clara. One night, she awoke her parents with a blood-curdling scream. When they rushed into her room, they found her sitting upright in bed, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. She pointed to the corner of her room, her finger trembling. It was there, she whispered, her voice barely audible. A shadow. It was standing right there, and it told me not to look at the grave. Her parents tried to comfort her, but Clara refused to sleep alone after that, and she wasn't the only one. Several other children reported similar encounters, and soon the entire village was gripped by fear. Families took to sleeping together in the same rooms, candles burning throughout the night in a futile attempt to keep the shadows at bay. But the whispering shadows were not deterred by light. Those who watched closely began to notice that the shadows didn't cast reflections. They moved as though they were alive, writhing and shifting unnaturally, and they always stayed just out of reach. One man tried to confront them, swinging a lantern at a shadow that lingered outside his barn. The light passed through it harmlessly, as though it wasn't there, but the man swore he felt an icy chill as the shadow moved closer. "They aren't just shadows," he said to the others the next day. "There's something worse, something alive." The priest's grave became the epicenter of the activity. By now, no one dared approach it, not even during the day. The once straight lines of the grave had begun to sag, as though the earth itself was struggling to contain whatever lay beneath. The villagers who lived closest to the cemetery reported hearing strange noises at all hours, scratching, faint laughter, and a deep, guttural sound that didn't resemble anything human. One night, a small group of villagers gathered their courage and ventured to the graveyard to see for themselves what was happening. Armed with torches and pitchforks, they crept through the mist-laden cemetery, their breaths visible in the unnaturally cold air. When they reached the priest's grave, they froze in horror. The shadows were there, circling the grave like a slow-moving storm. They pulsed and shifted, their edges fraying like smoke in the wind, but their forms were unmistakably humanoid. The villagers watched, transfixed, as the shadows seemed to bow toward the grave, their indistinct heads dipping as though in reverence or worship. Then, as one, the shadows turned to face the villagers. The torches flickered wildly, and a chill swept through the air. The villagers stood paralyzed, unable to look away from the formless faces of the shadows. One of the men, a hunter known for his bravery, stepped forward and shouted, "What do you want?" For a moment, the shadows were still. Then a voice emerged from the center of the grave. It wasn't the voice of the priest, but something deeper, more ancient and filled with malice. "He will not rest," it said, the words echoing through the air like the toll of a bell. "And neither will you." The torches extinguished simultaneously, plunging the cemetery into darkness. The villagers fled, stumbling over tombstones and each other in their desperate attempt to escape. When they returned to the safety of their homes, they found strange marks on their skin, long, thin scratches that burned and itched but had no clear source. From that night onward, the shadows were everywhere. They moved openly through the village, their presence felt in every corner, every home. People whispered of curses, of sins left unatoned, and of a wrath that could not be appeased. The graveyard was abandoned entirely, left to the whispering shadows and whatever force had awakened beneath the priest's grave. But the villagers knew one thing for certain: the shadows weren't just watching anymore, they were waiting. The night it happened, the village seemed eerily still. Even the persistent whispers and the movements of the shadows seemed to have subsided, leaving a silence so profound that it pressed against the ears like a tangible weight. The villagers, who had grown accustomed to the nightly disturbances, were caught off guard by this sudden and unnatural calm. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to unfold. Midnight came, and with it, the sound that would shatter the fragile silence, a deep, resonant toll from the church bell. The villagers woke with a start, their hearts pounding in their chests. The bell hadn't rung in decades. It was rusted and cracked, its mechanisms long since broken. Yet here it was, its mournful chime reverberating through the village, echoing like a dirge for the damned. At first, no one dared to investigate. Families huddled together in their homes, clutching rosaries and murmuring prayers under their breath. But the bell didn't stop. It tolled again and again, each chime more deafening than the last. Finally, a few brave souls ventured out into the cold night, drawn toward the sound like moths to a flame. The church stood at the heart of the village, a looming silhouette against the starless sky. Its windows were dark, and the wooden door creaked ominously in the wind. Yet, as the villagers approached, they saw that the bell tower was illuminated by a faint, unnatural glow. Shadows danced within the light, flickering and writhing as if alive. The group hesitated at the church's entrance, their breaths visible in the icy air. One of them, a middle-aged man named Harold, swallowed hard and pushed open the door. It swung inward with a groan, revealing the dark, cavernous interior of the church. The air inside was cold, colder than it should have been, and carried a metallic tang that made their skin crawl. The bell continued to toll, though no one could see how it was ringing. The mechanisms were still rusted and unmoving, yet the sound resonated, impossibly loud and clear. The villagers stood frozen in the doorway, their eyes drawn to the altar at the far end of the church. There, standing motionless, was a figure in priestly robes. The figure's back was to them, its head bowed as if in prayer. The robes were tattered and filthy, their once bright colors faded to dull gray. The villagers exchanged nervous glances, their instincts screaming at them to flee, but their legs felt rooted to the ground. "Father?" Harold called out, tentatively, his voice trembling. There was no response. The figure didn't move. Slowly, cautiously, the group stepped further into the church, the wooden floorboards creaking beneath their weight. The closer they got to the altar, the colder the air became, and the faint glow from the bell tower seemed to dim, casting long, unnatural shadows across the walls. When they were just a few feet away, the figure finally moved. It lifted its head slowly, as though burdened by an immense weight, and turned to face them. The villagers gasped in unison, their hearts dropping into their stomachs. It was the priest, but not as they remembered him. His face was pale and gaunt, his skin stretched tightly over his bones. His eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the darkness, and his lips were cracked and bloodless. Yet his expression was not one of anger, it was one of profound sorrow. The priest opened his mouth, and when he spoke, his voice was a low, reverberating whisper that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Why did you forsake me?" he asked, the words cutting through the air like a knife. "Why did you leave me to suffer?" The villagers stood frozen, unable to speak, their minds reeling. The priest took a step forward, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were fighting against an unseen force. With each step, the temperature in the room seemed to drop further, frost forming on the pews and creeping up the walls. "You heard my cries," the priest continued, his voice growing louder, more insistent. "You heard me plead for mercy, and you turned away. You buried me alive, and now you will understand what it means to be forsaken." The bell tolled again, louder than ever, its sound reverberating through the church and rattling the stained glass windows. The light in the bell tower flared briefly, casting the priest's shadow across the walls. But the shadow didn't match his form. It was larger, more monstrous, with clawed hands and elongated limbs that stretched impossibly far. One of the villagers screamed, breaking the spell that held them in place. They turned and ran, fleeing the church and spilling out into the night. The bell continued to toll as they stumbled through the streets, its mournful chime following them like a curse. When they returned to their homes, they found strange symbols etched into their doors, symbols they didn't recognize but instinctively feared. The frost that had formed in the church now covered their windows, and their breaths misted in the air inside their homes. The tolling of the bell finally stopped, but its echo lingered in their minds, a haunting reminder of what they had witnessed, The next morning, the church bell was silent, and the figure of the priest was gone. But the villagers knew he wasn't truly gone. They could still feel his presence, like a shadow that hung over the village, watching, waiting. From that night on, no one dared enter the church. The building was left to decay, its doors chained shut and its windows boarded up. But at midnight, when the wind was just right, the villagers swore they could still hear the faint tolling of the bell calling out to them, a reminder of the sin they could never escape. The priest had returned, and his sorrow had turned to wrath. The morning after, the church bell had tolled, and the priest's apparition had appeared. A heavy gloom settled over the village. The streets were empty, the usual hustle and bustle of daily life replaced by an eerie stillness. No one dared to speak of what they had seen the night before. It was as though naming it would give it more power, would solidify the nightmare into an unchangeable reality. But even in silence, everyone felt the same truth. The priest's suffering had awakened something dark, and it would not be appeased. The strange symbols etched into the villagers' doors were the first sign that the curse was spreading. At first glance, the symbols looked like scratches, but closer inspection revealed intricate patterns. Arcane shapes that seemed to twist and shift when looked at for too long. No one could identify them, but all who saw them felt a cold dread seep into their bones. Attempts to scrub or paint over the markings were futile. They reappeared by the next morning, even darker and more defined than before. Then came the sickness. It started with the animals. The few livestock that remained after the shadows began haunting the village grew lethargic and stopped eating. Their eyes glazed over, and they shivered violently despite the mild weather. Within days, they were dead. The villagers buried the carcasses far from the village, hoping to prevent the spread of whatever illness had struck them, but it was already too late. The people began falling ill next. At first, it was nothing more than a persistent chill, an inability to stay warm no matter how many layers they wore or how many fires they lit. Then came the dreams. Each night, the villagers were plagued by visions of the priest's grave. In their dreams, they were buried alive, the weight of the earth pressing down on them, filling their mouths, their noses, their lungs. They awoke, gasping for air, their bodies drenched in sweat, the feeling of suffocation lingering long after they opened their eyes. But the worst was yet to come. The villagers began to hear the priest's voice during the day. It would call to them from the corners of their homes, from the shadows of the streets, from the wind that whistled through the trees. His voice was soft and mournful, full of sorrow and accusation. "Why did you leave me?" he would whisper. "Why did you not save me?" No one could escape his voice. It followed them everywhere, a constant reminder of their guilt. And as the days turned into weeks, the priest's tone began to change. The sorrow gave way to anger, the whispers growing louder and sharper. "You will know my pain," he said over and over, until the words became a chant that echoed endlessly in their minds. Desperate to put an end to the curse, the villagers gathered in the square to discuss what to do. The elder, who had been their leader for decades, stood at the center, his hands trembling as he spoke. "We must face this," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We must right our wrongs." "But how?" someone shouted. "We buried him alive. He'll never forgive us." "We dig up the grave," another villager suggested. "We bring him out and give him the burial he deserves." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, but not everyone was convinced. "And what if we make it worse?" a woman cried. "What if disturbing the grave again only angers him more?" Despite the fear and hesitation, the villagers agreed that something had to be done. That night, under the cover of darkness, a small group of volunteers made their way to the cemetery. They carried shovels and lanterns, their steps slow and hesitant as they approached the priest's grave. The air was colder than it should have been, and the wind carried a faint, mournful wail that seemed to come from the earth itself. When they reached the grave, they froze. The ground around it was disturbed, as though something had been digging its way out from below. The wooden cross that marked the grave was split in two, and the soil was unnaturally dark, almost black, as if it had been tainted by something malevolent. Despite their terror, the villagers began to dig. The shovels sank easily into the loose soil, and with each scoop, the air grew heavier, the whispers louder. By the time they reached the coffin, their hands were shaking so badly that they could barely hold their tools. The lid of the coffin was cracked and splintered, as though something inside had tried to force its way out. One of the men mustered his courage and pried the lid open. What they saw inside would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The coffin was empty. For a moment, no one moved. They simply stared into the dark, hollow space where the priest's body should have been. Then, from the darkness, a voice emerged, low, guttural, and filled with rage. "I will never rest," it said, the words reverberating through the ground beneath their feet. The villagers stumbled back, their lanterns flickering wildly as a shadow rose from the coffin. It wasn't the priest. Not exactly. The figure that emerged was a twisted, distorted version of him, its body elongated and its face contorted with anger and pain. Its glowing eyes bore into the villagers, and when it spoke again, its voice was deafening. "You will all pay for what you have done." The shadows that had haunted the village erupted from the ground, engulfing the villagers in darkness. They fled, screaming, as the shadows pursued them, their laughter echoing through the night. By the time they reached their homes, the graveyard was silent once more. But the terror was far from over. The next morning, the villagers found the same message carved into every door, every wall, every surface in the village. "I will never rest." The curse had spread, and there was no escape. One by one, the villagers abandoned the village, leaving it to the shadows and the restless spirit that had claimed it. And as the years passed, the village became a ghost town, a place whispered about in fearful tones. But those who dared to venture there claimed they could still hear the bell tolling at midnight and the priest's voice calling out from the shadows, "You will know my pain.